Some people think that if you keep moving in a van, nobody can do anything about it. But that doesn't really match how things work in practice. Movement can reduce planning problems, but it exposes you to an entirely different set of laws. The question isn't whether you're visible, it's which authorities notices you first. So can constant movement really keep you outside the reach of enforcement? And interestingly, I'm actually staying in a sports centre car park at the moment in my van, so I'm living the reality of the book. And this is part 28 of the video series, and we're still on chapter 3, living on the land or water, parking up and planning reality. And this is the first in a number of case studies we're going to do using the information we've already covered in the chapter. So, case study, rotation without visibility. A single vehicle operates within a loose network of locations across a town. It does not settle. It arrives late, often after activity has died down, and leaves early before the day properly begins. It carries everything with it and leaves nothing behind. No chairs, no waste, no visible signs of occupation. Each stop is temporary, almost incidental, and rarely repeated in exactly the same way. At this level, the activity sits in a grey space within the law. Simply parking a vehicle on a public road in itself is not unlawful, provided it complies with general road traffic regulations under the Road Traffic Regulations Act 1984. If the vehicle is taxed, insured and legally parked, its presence alone is not a breach of planning control. Crucially, planning law under the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 is generally concerned with the use of land, not the transient movement of a vehicle that does not establish a fixed base. This is where the movement becomes significant. By not remaining in one place long enough to establish a pattern of residential use, the vehicle avoids creating what could be argued as a material change of use of any particular piece of land. There is no single location where occupation can be clearly evidenced over time. Instead, the activity disperses itself across multiple locations, each used briefly without accumulation. In practice, enforcement relies heavily on evidence and pattern. A caravan or vehicle stationed on the same land with signs of ongoing occupation can be identified, monitored and acted upon. A vehicle that moves continuously, leaving no trace and no fixed point of reference, is much harder to define within the framework. It does not become invisible in a literal sense. It may be seen many times, but it does not consolidate into something that can easily be classified and enforced as a planning breach. That said, movement is not a shield against all forms of enforcement. Other legal frameworks still apply. Local authorities have powers under the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 to direct vehicles to leave land in certain circumstances, particularly where there is disruption, damage or multiple vehicles involved. Separate provisions exist under the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, which strengthen powers related to unauthorised encampments in specific conditions. While these are more commonly used against groups, they can still become relevant depending on context. There are also local controls. Parking restrictions, traffic orders and bylaws can limit where a vehicle may stay, regardless of how briefly. Repeated overnight parking in controlled zones, residential streets with permit schemes or areas subject to specific restrictions can draw attention even without long stays. In those cases, it is not planning law that triggers enforcement, but road traffic and local authority powers. The key point is that movement changes the nature of the activity. A fixed presence invites classification. A moving presence resists it. By never staying long enough to establish continuity in one place, the vehicle avoids forming the kind of evidence that planning enforcement depends on. But this is not the same as being outside the law. It is simply operating within a different part of it. Over time, this pattern of movement can become effectively invisible in administrative terms, not because it is hidden, but because it never resolves into something stable enough to act upon. There is no single site to investigate, no continuous use to document, no clear threshold crossed in one location. The activity exists, but does not accumulate. However, this approach has its limits. If movement becomes predictable, the same streets, the same rotation, the same informal network of stops, it can begin to look like a pattern again. And once a pattern can be demonstrated, enforcement becomes easier. Visibility is not only about being seen, it's about being understood and recorded. In that sense, movement can reduce risk, but it cannot eliminate it. It shifts the activity away from planning control and towards other areas of law, what it avoids is permanence. And in a system that relies on permanence to act, that absence can be enough to delay or diffuse enforcement, even if it never fully escapes it. So movement changes the type of enforcement you face, but it doesn't remove it. By avoiding a fixed base, you may avoid creating the evidence planning authorities rely on, yet road traffic law, local restriction and other powers remain. Freedom isn't simply about moving, it's about understanding which legal framework applies at any given moment. Which means the issue may not just be where you park, it might actually be how modern society responds to people who choose to live in one permanent place. Is movement a form of freedom, or simply another way of negotiating control? Right, next up, still in chapter 3, living on the land or water, parking up and planning reality, and we've got the second case study, which is land use without permission.